It is no secret that the Catholic Church has a history that is both bizarre and, at times, very macabre. Among many strange tales, one of the most infamous is the event known as the Cadaver Synod. Held in 897 at St. John Lateran Cathedral in Rome, the Cadaver Synod was the trial of Pope Formosus. However, as the word cadaver would suggest, it was not Formosus himself who stood trial. Instead, it was his decaying corpse, which was exhumed and then put on trial. Today, in what will be episode number 2 of my Kryptik Kocktales series, we're going to take a look at what led to the trial of Pope Formosus, as well as the repercussions that came afterward. And if you haven't seen episode number 1, the point of this series is to take a more relaxed and hydrated look at certain topics that will contrast with my regular, more researched videos. So, if the topic or premise sounds interesting, join me as we try to understand just what happened in this very bizarre case. The most important thing to understand about the story is that Italy was incredibly unstable in the 9th century, and the papacy was much different than what it is now. These two things are directly correlated with one another, because instead of the Pope being chosen for more religious enlightenment, they were more so chosen for political reasons. Specifically, anyone who seeked to be crowned the Holy Roman Emperor at the time needed approval from the Pope. Given that multiple factions had risen to power due to the national instability, you had a scene where multiple factions were trying to find advantages over one another. So what these factions would do is they would often forcefully enlist bishops into their ranks and do anything and everything to try to get their man elected for the papacy. Since so many factions were vying for their man to be selected, that would put the man who was selected in a pretty difficult position. And by difficult, I mean every pope had to kind of constantly be looking over their shoulders for potential assassins. But considering we're discussing the 9th and 10th century in this story, and the life expectancy in that time was pretty abysmal, most often than not, Father Time took care of everyone's dirty work. To kind of exemplify that statement, in the 9th century alone, 21 popes were elected. Of those 21, our story today mostly concerns number 12, number 15, and number 17. Those being Pope John VIII, Pope Formosus, and Pope Stephen XI, respectively. Sorry, I meant Pope Stephen VI, not the 11th. Like I said, I'm hydrated. Believed to have been born sometime during 816, Formosus was a Roman native. Due to the period in which this story takes place, not much is known about Formosus's early years. In fact, not really much at all is known until he became the Cardinal Bishop of Porto, Italy in 864. By all accounts, Formosus was very successful in his position, and as a result, he was sent to Bulgaria in 866 as a legate by the request of Pope Nicholas I. And basically, a legate is someone sent as an ambassador for the church, who is supposed to kind of be the direct representative of the Pope. Similar to his time in Porto, Formosus was extremely successful in Bulgaria. So successful that Boris I, the at the time ruler of Bulgaria, personally requested that Formosus be appointed Archbishop of Bulgaria. This request was quickly denied by Pope Nicholas because, at the time, bishops were forbidden from leading more than one see. In Catholic speak, a see is an office or area a bishop is responsible for. And the reason this rule was in place was to prevent bishops from gathering or forming their own sort of factions. After this, Nicholas I summoned Formosus back to Italy, but due to his success in Porto and news reaching Italy of his success in Bulgaria, Formosus was starting to become quite popular in Rome. Nicholas and his successor, Pope Adrian II, didn't see this as any sort of issue. Pope John VIII, however, saw this as a huge issue. John accused Formosus of attempting to become Bishop of Bulgaria while already stationed in Porto. Additionally, he accused Formosus of being a traitor because he publicly disapproved of Charles II, who was at the time, king of Italy. Lastly, John claimed Formosus had broken the rules of the church by publicly stating he wanted the papacy, or, he publicly stated he wished to be the Pope. When these charges were brought forward and a synod was arranged, Formosus fled to France with many of his followers. Due to his failure to appear and his fleeing from Italy, Formosus and all of his associates were excommunicated from the church. For the next 6 years, Formosus and his associates hid in France. Then, in 882, Pope John VIII was murdered by one of his clerics, becoming the first pope to ever be assassinated. Unsurprisingly, after the death of John, Formosus's troubles seemed to just disappear. In 883, John's successor, Pope Marinus I, lifted the excommunication and reinstated Formosus as the Bishop of Porto. Now, Marinus served as pope until 884, then was succeeded by Adrian III, who only served until 885. Then, in 885, Stephen V was elected and served until 891, at which point Formosus was finally elected pope. By the time Formosus was appointed to the papacy, Italy had a new emperor, that being Guy III. Now, both Formosus and Guy were deeply distrustful of one another, and both were pretty aware that they didn't trust one another. In an attempt to protect the throne, Guy forced Formosus to crown his son Lambert as co-emperor in 892. And, as I said, Guy knew Formosus was distrustful of him, but wasn't super aware that the newly elected pope was actively planning to overthrow him. To do this, Formosus had been secretly messaging King Arnulf of Germany in an attempt to convince him to invade Italy and overthrow Guy. If he were to do this, Formosus promised to name Arnulf as the new Roman emperor. And in 893, Arnulf decided to march on Italy, and by 894, he and his army had captured a large portion of northern Italy, but needed assistance to help gain any more ground. That assistance came in the form of Guy dying in December of that year, and even though Lambert was technically emperor after that, he was still pretty young, so Guy's wife, Agiltrude, took charge. In autumn 895, Arnulf once again began marching towards Rome, and this time he successfully overthrew Agiltrude on February 21st, 896. The following day, Formosus crowned Arnulf as the new king and emperor of Italy. But just over 2 weeks later, Arnulf suffered a stroke which left him paralyzed from the waist down. This would have major ramifications for Italy in the future, but it was a future that Pope Formosus wouldn't live to see, since he passed away in early April 896, less than 2 months after he had crowned Arnulf. Following Formosus's death, Pope Boniface VI was elected. However, he died just 16 days into his reign, and to this day he is the second shortest reigning pope in history. Following his death, Pope Stephen VII, or the 6th, oh god, these Roman numerals are throwing me off. Pope Stephen VI was elected. By the time Stephen was elected, and remember, this was only a month or so after Formosus' death, Arnulf had already lost control of Italy. Now, when I say he lost, I don't mean that in the way you're probably thinking. He lost pretty much due to a technicality. When Formosus died, his crowning of Arnulf fell with him, meaning the crown was immediately given back to Lambert. To make it official, Stephen soon after called Lambert. To make it official, Stephen soon after called Lambert back to Rome and crowned him as the new emperor. Then, in early 897, Stephen called for a synod. Now, a synod, in simplest terms, is a gathering or council of faith leaders regarding some sort of topic or issue within the church. One possible issue that could be discussed was the possibility a bishop had overreached and broken the rules of the church and papacy. If you remember, there was a belief against Formosus that had begun with John VIII, and Stephen just so happened to agree with all of those accusations. After taking over, Stephen repeatedly slandered Formosus and accused him of every charge John had previously brought against him. However, when a synod was called to discuss the legitimacy of Formosus, pretty much everyone was confused. By the time of the synod, Formosus had been dead for nearly 9 months, and most of Italy had just moved on. But, you know, it wasn't exactly that crazy to call a synod to determine whether a previous pope had performed any wrongdoing. And, you know, it's not like they were going to dig up his body and put it on trial, were they? So, in January 897, Stephen had the body of Formosus dug up and put on trial. Not only did he have the late pope's body dug up, but he also had the decomposing corpse dressed in papal robes and placed on a throne for the trial. For the trial, Formosus' corpse was assigned a deacon to essentially serve as his defense, but this whole thing was pretty much just for show. As soon as the trial began, Stephen lashed out at the corpse and echoed all of John VIII's earlier accusations against Formosus. The deacon, mostly just appalled by the entire thing, had very little to say in between Stephen's verbal assaults against the corpse. And according to legend, while the trial was taking place, an earthquake shook Rome. And, you know, any normal person would probably take this as some sort of ominous warning about what they're doing. But Stephen didn't take it as that and just continued his ranting and, of course, eventually found Formosus' rotting corpse guilty. And as if the entire trial itself wasn't bad enough, after the guilty verdict, Stephen had the papal robes torn from the corpse and even had the 3 fingers Formosus used for blessings chopped off before having the body reburied at a different location in an unmarked grave. However, even this seemingly wasn't enough for Stephen, because he had Formosus dug up again just to toss his body into the Tiber River. Soon after, a fisherman managed to recover Formosus' body from the river and buried it in a secret location in Portus to prevent any further desecration by Stephen. Unsurprisingly, most of the Roman people saw the trial as a complete and utter disgrace, and soon the public opinion of Stephen was completely diminished. So much so that in August 897, the people of Rome rioted and threw Stephen in prison for the trial. Soon after, Stephen was strangled to death in his cell, and after his death, Pope Romanus was elected, but didn't have much to really say regarding the trial. However, his successor, Pope Theodore II, decided to take direct action against the trial. He claimed the entire thing as null and void and arranged for Formosus' body to be retrieved from Portus and returned to St. Peter's Basilica for a proper burial. But Theodore died after a reign of only 20 days and was succeeded by Pope John IX. Luckily, John was also pro-Formosus and saw to it that the reburial was finished, and called his own synod to officially erase the findings of the Cadaver Synod. As a bonus, John also saw to it that nothing like this could happen again, and prohibited the trying of a corpse within the church. And I would like to say that's where the story ends, but unfortunately we have one more pope to discuss, which is Pope Sergius III. Sergius was elected about 4 years after John's reign had ended, and unlike John, Sergius was pro-Stephen regarding the Cadaver Synod. So, early in his reign, Sergius had Stephen's findings of the original synod reconfirmed. But I wouldn't take anything Sergius said seriously for one simple and complex reason. Sergius's stint as pope began what is now known as the pornocracy or rule of the harlots. It does have a Latin name that I'm not even going to try to get myself to pronounce while I'm drunk or when I'm hydrated. During this era, which lasted about 60 years, the papacy was completely corrupted and allegedly influenced by the Theophylacti family. Most often, the family made its way into the papacy by having certain women of the family attempt to seduce whichever pope was serving. Sergius just so happened to be the first one to fall for this seduction by a girl named Marozia. From this seduction, the 15-year-old Marozia became the concubine to the 45-year-old Sergius. Theodora, who was Marozia's mother, was also reportedly a mistress to Sergius. With Sergius fully under their spells, Theodora and Marozia were soon propelled to high positions within the church, and those positions that they were now in were often responsible for selecting and electing candidates for the papacy. Around 930, Marozia had reached her peak and held massive sway within the church. And while Theodora was undoubtedly involved, Marozia is the main reason the pornocracy occurred. She was a well-known sexual deviant and had been married multiple times and had numerous affairs. Out of these marriages and affairs, Marozia had multiple children and later grandchildren. And just to show you how far she had reached in the papacy, one of her sons, one of her grandsons, one of her great-grandsons, and two of her great-great-grandsons would eventually be elected pope. Unsurprisingly, this is not a time the Catholic Church really likes to discuss, and they describe it as one of the darkest moments in the history of the church. It's something they kind of just wipe from their hands, and agree it was a horrible time in the church. Because, you know, it was an era of the church that was riddled with scandal, corruption, and sexual deviancy. And, you know, surely nothing like that would happen today. So, with that, our coverage of the Cadaver Synod comes to a close. What a weird and ridiculous story. Like I said all the way back in the beginning, I would wager that most everyone is aware that the church, especially the Catholic Church, has had some disturbing and weird history sort of attached to it. But when you do see it as explicitly as you do in this story, it does, at least for me, it can kind of catch you off guard. Like, in the story, they did really dig up a dead pope just to put him on trial and desecrate everything about him. Afterwards, he was returned to his previous status, only to be then condemned again at the beginning of what is considered one of the worst times for the papacy. So, yeah, it's just a crazy but entirely true story. But with that, I don't really have much else to say. Please let me know what you think about the story down in the comments. And if you have any other recommendations for topics I can cover, or just general critiques, please let me know. Also, let me know, like, more in-depth videos that you want. I have an idea already for what the next topic's going to be. But something, you can give me ideas for more, like, my more in-depth videos. You can give me more stuff like this, where it's kind of more just a kind of ridiculous story that can kind of be summarized, that doesn't need nearly as much research as my other videos. Just anything you all want to hear me talk about, just let me know. And like I said, any general critiques about the videos, let me know. But as always, thank you all so much for watching. Thank you for the continued support on, well, on everything, on the channel, on older videos. And yeah, I think that's it. So I hope to see you all again very soon.